Ruth, a 60-year-old widow, started her day as usual. She sat on the porch of her home in the Chicago suburbs, drinking coffee and flipping through the newspaper. Her life was peaceful, though lonely. Her daughter Alice, whom she raised alone after her husband's death, was her pride and support. But that morning, a simple phone call changed everything. The phone rang. On the other end of the line was Mrs. Harper, a neighbor who always had the latest news about everything that was happening. Her voice sounded exciting. "Ruth, did you know Alice was getting married? I saw her in her wedding dress last week." Ruth froze. Her first reaction was that this was some kind of joke, but Mrs. Harper's tone was too serious. Ruth tried to calm herself, but her hands were shaking. She opened her phone and went to Alice's social media. There was nothing, no hints, photos, or messages. Instead, her attention was drawn to the profile of Jason, a man Ruth knew only as Alice's friend. On his page were several photos from his wedding party. Ruth felt betrayed. How could her only daughter do something so important without telling her? She tried to justify Alice. Maybe it was an impulsive mistake. Maybe they planned to tell her later. But the more she thought about it, the more anger she felt. Her Ruth immediately called Alice. Her daughter answered, but her voice sounded nervous. "Mom, I'll explain everything to you. It's just that now is not the time." Not the time. "Alice, you got married and didn't even tell me." How could you do this to me?" Ruth's voice was trembling. "It was a quick decision. We didn't want to make a show of it," Alice replied. Ruth insisted on meeting. She wanted to see Alice and Jason in person. A few days later, they showed up on her doorstep. Jason, a young man with a charming smile, tried to look confident, but Ruth could sense that something was wrong behind his outward charm. Alice looked guilty, but insisted that they did it out of love. "Mom, I'm an adult. I have the right to make my own decisions. Decisions that affect not only you, but your family," Ruth replied. During the conversation, Jason mentioned that they had already started discussing some financial issues, but quickly changed the subject. This seemed suspicious to Ruth. When they left, Ruth was left alone with her thoughts. Something was wrong. Her heart told her that this story had a darker side than just a secret wedding. Ruth decided not to let this go. She knew that she had to find out the truth, even if it meant digging deeper than she would have liked. Ruth had been the pillar of her family all her life. After the tragic death of her husband in a car accident, when Alice was only 6 years old, Ruth took on the role of both mother and father. She worked as a teacher, spent her evenings checking notebooks and finding time for the music lessons that Alice loved so much. For Ruth, her daughter was everything. She was proud of her success in school and then in college, where Alice received a scholarship for her achievements. At the same time, Ruth always tried to be a friend to her daughter, but it was not always easy. Alice grew up in an atmosphere of love and care, but she always wanted more. She wanted to prove to herself and the world that she could succeed on her own. Her career in marketing was growing rapidly, but she was lacking stability in her personal life. Jason, whom Alice met at a corporate event, became an unexpected crush. A few years younger than her, he had a lighthearted personality that contrasted with her seriousness. He promised the adventures she had long dreamed of, but at the same time he left many unanswered questions. Jason was a typical, charming guy. He knew how to speak in a way that made everyone around him feel special. His past remained a mystery, but Alice didn't want to pay attention to it. Ruth, however, had a different impression. Ruth remembered the first time she met Jason. It was at a family barbecue, where he looked a little awkward, but was trying very hard to impress. His jokes made everyone laugh except Ruth. Her intuition told her that there was something insincere behind his carefree demeanor. "You must be very proud of Alice," Jason said as he poured himself a lemonade. "Yes, I am," Ruth replied, but her eyes were scrutinizing his behavior. Ruth had always believed in the value of family. Every Sunday, she and Alice cooked dinner together, reminiscing about the recipes Ruth had learned from her mother. But after Jason came into Alice's life, these traditions began to disappear. Alice increasingly refused to attend family gatherings, making excuses about work or fatigue. Ruth felt that her daughter was withdrawing, but she didn't know how to stop it. One such situation occurred when Ruth organized a party in honor of her birthday. Alice promised to come, but a few hours before the event, she called to say that Jason had booked them a trip out of town. Mom, I promise we'll celebrate your day later. It was spontaneous, but he tried so hard, Alice justified. Ruth answered calmly, but the call hurt her, and as she realized that Jason was becoming the center of Alice's life, crowding out everything else. Ruth began to ask herself, was she being too controlling a mother? Could she have done something differently to keep their relationship close? At the same time, she felt that she was entitled to respect and honesty, especially after all she had done for her daughter. This episode ends with a scene where Ruth is sitting in her favorite chair with a photo of Alice in her hands. As she remembers holding her daughter in her arms on her birthday and can't understand how their relationship has come this far. I have to find out what's going on, Ruth says to herself, her voice determined. After a few weeks of Alice's strange behavior, Ruth began to notice new details. Her daughter's phone calls would stop when she walked into the room. Alice often looked anxious and avoided direct contact with her mother. One day, Ruth decided to drop by Alice's apartment unannounced to drop off some fresh-baked goods. She was surprised to find an unusually large number of envelopes on the table with the words urgent and bank logos on them. Are you, Elise, in trouble? Ruth asked, looking at her daughter who seemed frozen in place. It's just some paperwork, Mom. Don't worry, Alice replied hastily, picking up the envelopes from the table. Ruth knew Alice was lying. Her mother had taught her to notice the slightest changes in people's behavior, and now her intuition was screaming that something was wrong. That night, Ruth decided not to wait for any more explanations and to find out for herself what was going on. Ruth remembered that Alice used one of the local banks for all her financial transactions. She went there only one name, her daughter's. The bank manager, an elderly man named Harold, recognized Ruth because she had once helped Alice open her first account. Mrs. Ada Miller, I can't disclose financial information without your daughter's permission, he said, sounding sorry. I just want to know if my daughter is safe. Her behavior is causing me concern, Ruth insisted. After a short pause, Hare added quietly, your daughter has several active loans, and it looks like one of them is on the verge of default. The news hit Ruth like a bolt of lightning. She had never imagined that Alice would be so deeply in financial trouble. She remembered how not long ago Alice had bought a new car and made expensive gifts for Jason. Is she living beyond her means because of him? Ruth wondered as she sat in her car after the conversation at the bank. To get more information, Ruth decided to talk to Alice's neighbor, Tom, who often helped her daughter with household chores. Your daughter seems very generous. She's mentioned several times that she supports Jason financially, Tom said. This was the last straw. Ruth realized that Jason was not only influencing Alice, but was also the cause of her financial problems. Ruth decided it was time to talk. She wanted to get the truth directly from her daughter, but she knew it would be a difficult conversation. Ruth returned home to collect her thoughts and prepare for what she might hear. As she opened an old box of family photos, trying to find answers to the question, when exactly did her daughter lose control of her life? I have to save Alice, even if she doesn't want me to, Ruth decided firmly. Ruth realized that to resolve the situation, she needed to find out who Jason was and what his true intentions were. Her daughter, Alice, refused to talk about it directly, so Ruth decided to act decisively. One evening, when Jason walked into Alice's apartment, Ruth was there too, trying to help with dinner. We need to talk, Jason, Ruth said bluntly, looking him in the eye. Jason tried to smile, but his smile was forced. About what, Mrs. Miller? Ruth noticed him rubbing his hands together nervously. About Alice's financial problems and your role in them, she replied, not looking away. At first, Jason tried to deny it. He told her hard he worked and how much he loved Alice. However, under Ruth's pressure, he began to tell the truth. I didn't mean for it to turn out this way, he sighed. I had big plans. I wanted to start my own business, and Alice agreed to help me. Ruth listened intently, trying to remain calm, even though she was seething inside. I borrowed money, thinking I would be able to pay it back soon. But then everything went wrong. Jason admitted that he had convinced Alice to take out loans in her name, promising quick profits. He painted her pictures of a future together, full of prosperity and success. I just wanted us to be happy, he justified. But Ruth couldn't let that go. So you decided to risk her financial security, she asked. After several hours of conversation, Ruth was able to find out that Jason had significant debts before he met Alice. He was an adventurer who tried to make a quick buck through risky investments but failed. I knew I couldn't pay off my debts on my own, Jason finally admitted, but Alice was willing to help. Ruth was amazed. A hat at her daughter was just a tool in Jason's plans, and although he claimed to love her, his actions said otherwise. You say you love Alice, but your love is just words. True Lou would not have ruined her life, Ruth said sharply. Jason tried to defend himself, but Ruth was not listening. She saw him as a person who was not ready to take responsibility for his actions. If you really want to make a difference, you'll have to prove it, she said, leaving him alone with his thoughts. Ruth decided that her next step was to talk to Alice. She knew that her daughter deserved the truth, even if it was painful. Ruth decided to act decisively. She invited Alice to dinner at their favorite restaurant to talk privately. Alice was surprised by her mother's serious tone, but agreed to come. At the table, in a cozy atmosphere, Ruth began the conversation calmly. Alice, I've always been honest with you, and now it's time for you to be honest with me, she said. Alice tensed. What are you talking about, Mom? Ruth took a deep breath and began. I know about Jason's debts. And I know that he used you to pay them off. Alice flinched, but quickly regained her composure. It's not as simple as you think, Mom, she said, looking away. No, Alice, it is. He's dragged you into his problems, and now you're risking everything you have, Ruth insisted. Alice abruptly put her water glass on the table. You've always been against Jason! From the very beginning, you've been looking for his faults. It's not about my prejudices, Alice. It's about the facts, Ruth replied. He took your money, he manipulated you, and now he's leaving you in debt. Alice tried to justify her husband. Jason just wanted what was best for us. He took risks to build our future. Ruth couldn't believe what she was hearing. Alice, do you even hear yourself? He didn't risk his money, he risked your money, and you think this is love. Alice looked away. Mom, I'm an adult. I can decide for myself what's best for me. Ruth felt herself struggling to breathe, and she could see her daughter defending herself, trying to justify her mistakes. Do you know what the worst part is, Alice? I've always trusted you. I was sure you would never go against your principles. But now I see you sacrificing everything for a man who doesn't deserve it, Ruth said in tears. Alice was silent, her eyes filled with tears. I didn't mean for this to happen, Mom, she said quietly, but I love him. Ruth leaned closer to her daughter. A love does not mean destroying your life. Love is respect and honesty, and what Jason is doing is not love. Alice began to cry. She realized that Ruth was right, but it was hard for her to admit it. What should I do, Mom? She asked. Ruth squeezed her hand. You have to protect yourself. If Jason really loves you, he will understand and change. But if not, you shouldn't stay with a man who is destroying you. Alice agreed to think about her mother's words, but left the restaurant in confusion. Ruth felt she had done her best, but the outcome was uncertain. Ruth could no longer stand by. She realized it was time to look Jason in the eye. Determined to act decisively, she invited him to a conversation in a neutral place, a cafe where no one knew them. But when Jason showed up, he looked calm and confident. His manner, almost cocky, made Ruth even angrier. Thank you for coming, she said, trying to keep her cool. Of course, Ruth. What is it? Replied, smiling as if nothing had happened. Ruth put down her coffee cup and leaned forward. What's the matter? Are you seriously asking? Jason, I know everything. Jason flinched slightly, but quickly regained his composure. Everything. What are you talking about? About your debts, about how you used Alice and sold out our family's security for your own gain. Ruth replied sharply. Ruth, it's not what you think. I had a plan. I wanted Alice and I to build something more.
He began?
Ruth could barely contain her anger. You called deception and manipulation a plan. You risked everything she had and didn't even tell her the truth. Jason began to twist the ring nervously on his finger. Look, I wanted to make things right. It's only temporary. Temporary. Do you realize you've left my daughter with nothing? That she's at risk of losing everything because you couldn't deal with your own problems. Her voice began to tremble with emotion. Ruth, I love Alice. Jason tried to justify himself. You do. Love does not look like betrayal. A love is honesty and responsibility, not using another person, Ruth replied. You don't understand what it means to struggle, Ruth, Jason suddenly blurted out. Ruth took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. It's not easy for me to say. I know what it's like to struggle. I built my life brick by brick, without lies or manipulation. And so I will not allow you to destroy my daughter's life. You have no right to interfere in our lives. Jason exclaimed, raising his voice. I have every right to, because this is my daughter and my family, and if you think I'm just going to back down, you're very much mistaken, Ruth replied firmly. Then Ruth pulled out some documents from her bag. Here's what I've done. I've collected all the facts, all your machinations. If you don't stop dragging Alice down with you, I'm going to take this to court. Jason fell silent, his face pale. You wouldn't do that, he said, but he sounded more afraid than confident. Yes, I would, and not only that. I'll find a way for Alice to see who you really are, Ruth replied firmly. Jason abruptly stood up and left without another word. Ruth remained sitting at the table, feeling both relieved and tense. This isn't over, she said quietly to herself as she watched Jason leave. After the tense meeting with Jason, Ruth returned home. She sat in her cozy living room, hugging a cup of hot tea, but she could feel everything boiling inside. Her thoughts were confused between anger pain and a sense of responsibility for her daughter. How can I let this go? Ruth thought. Ruth realized she had two options. The first was to take the documents to court and prove that Jason had not only manipulated Alice, but had also financially ruined their lives. It would be a hard blow that could have permanently destroyed the relationship between her and her daughter. The second option seemed more difficult. She could try to find a way to help Alice see the truth without revealing the whole dirty truth about Jason. But could she do it? In her thoughts, Ruth called her longtime friend and colleague Jack, whom she trusted more than anyone else. Jack, I'm in a situation where I don't know what to do. If I take drastic measures, I could lose Alice. But if I leave things as they are, she will lose even more, she explained. Jack thought for a few seconds before answering. Ruth, it's not your fault that she's in this situation, but maybe we should find a way to help her understand the truth without completely destroying her life. Had Ruth remembered how she had always taught Alice to fight for justice, but to always look for compromises. She recalled the moments when they overcame difficulties together, supporting each other. She was always a strong girl, Ruth whispered, but now she deserved to know the truth. Ruth began to analyze her fears. Her biggest concern was that Alice might side with Jason and leave her mother forever. Could I live with that? She asked herself. Ruth also realized that her silence could lead to Alice becoming even more financially and emotionally dependent on Jason. No, I can't just stay silent, Ruth decided, but I have to do it carefully in a way that gives Al a chance to figure out who Jason is for herself. Ruth decided to start small. As she prepared financial documents showing Jason's debts and gathered evidence of his manipulations. But instead of going straight to court, she decided to talk to Alice first. If I do this right, maybe she'll realize the truth and make the right decision, Ruth thought. Ruth sat down at her desk and wrote a letter to Alice, telling her about her feelings, her love for her daughter, and how she wanted to help. The letter was honest, but without harsh accusations. When she sealed the envelope, her hands trembled a little. It was the hardest decision she had ever made, but she knew she was doing it for her daughter's good. Atua, now it's up to her, Ruth said quietly, looking out the window. The morning began with a soft knock on the door. Ruth sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee, trying to calm her thoughts. Anna outside the window. The dawn was painting the sky pink, but her heart remained restless. Who can it be so early? She thought as she approached the door. Alice was standing in the doorway. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were determined. Mom, we need to talk," she said, nervously clasping her hands. Ruth invited her daughter inside. They sat down at the table and sat in silence for a minute. Alice looked like she was about to say something important, but was afraid. "I read your letter," Alice finally said. "At first I was angry. I thought you just didn't accept Jason because he didn't meet your expectations. But then, Alice looked down and pulled some papers out of her bag. "I checked what you wrote, and you were right." Ruth felt her heart race. She had been dreading this moment, but she knew it was inevitable. "What did you find out?" she asked cautiously. Alice told her that she had found evidence of Jason's debts and learned that he had been using her money to pay off old obligations. Moreover, he had secretly tried to access some of Ruth's assets through Alice. "I can't believe I was so narvy," Alice said, tears in her eyes. Ruth put her hand on her daughter's shoulder. We all make mistakes, Alice. The important thing is that you realize it now, not later, when it would be even worse." Then Alice looked up at her mother. Her eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. "I want to fix this, Mom, but I need your help." Ruth and Alice began to make a plan to resolve the situation with Jason. They decided to hire a lawyer to protect Ruth's finances and cut all ties with Jason. It's not going to be easy," Ruth said. "But you're strong, Alice. We'll get through this." Alice smiled for the first time in a long time. Thank you, Mom. I don't know what I would have done without you." A few weeks later, Ruth stood on the porch of her house and watched Alice pack her things. As she had decided to start a new life, leaving behind everything that connected her to Jason. Are you sure you're ready?" Ruth asked. "Yes," Alice replied. "It's hard, but I know it's the right thing to do." Ruth watched her daughter get into the car and drive away, her heart filled with sadness but also with pride. She knew that this was the beginning of a new chapter, not only for Alice, but for herself. At sunset that evening, Ruth sat on the veranda with a cup of tea and a notebook. She began to write a plan for her new project, something she had always wanted to do but had been putting off because of her responsibilities. Ruth looked at the horizon and smiled. Maybe this is not the end, but a new beginning, she told herself.